So we don't want to lose sight of some of the updates that are coming out of Israel, including a bombshell new report from UNRWA. Now, as we head into this segment, I just want you to keep in mind, as a context, that our government just officially certified that they have no evidence Israel is violating international humanitarian law. Okay? Keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's put this latest report from UNRWA on detainees, Palestinian detainees being held by Israel, being tortured. This matches up, by the way, with a number of prior media accounts. But I want to give you some of the specifics here because they really matter. So first of all, let me read a little bit from this report. They say ill treatment of detainees was reported to have occurred primarily while in the barracks and to have intensified in advance of interrogation sessions. This included being subjected to beatings while made to lie on a thin mattress on top of rubble for hours without food, water, or access to a toilet, with their legs and hands bound with plastic ties. As a side note, there are doctors who came out and said that amputations of limbs because of handcuffing procedures was commonplace in these facilities. The report goes on to say several detainees reported being forced into cages and attacked by dogs. Some released detainees, including a child, had dog bite wounds on their body. Detainees were threatened with prolonged detention, injury, or the killing of family members if they did not provide requested information. One detainee said, and this is difficult to hear, so warning there, but this is their quote, "They made me sit on something like a hot metal stick, and it felt like I have burns in the anus. The soldiers hit me with their shoes on my chest and used something like a metal stick that had a small nail on the side. They asked us to drink from the toilet and made the dogs attack us. There were people who were detained and killed, maybe 9 of them. One of them died after they put the electric stick up his anus. He got so sick, we saw worms coming out of his body, and then he died." That was an adult male detainee who was aged 41 years. There have been thousands of Palestinians that we know who have been detained by the Israelis since October 7th. In addition, and Saagar, this is very significant to the U.S. and our policy, because you'll recall, we led the charge in terms of defunding UNRWA, UNRWA being the #1 aid organization on the ground in Gaza. That is part of what has contributed to these disastrous humanitarian conditions, including mass epidemic of starvation and children literally starving to death. So we led the charge on that. Our Congress has now passed legislation that requires we continue the defunding of UNRWA through at least 2025. Well, and this was all based on these allegations that some UNRWA staff members participated in some way, some small number of UNRWA staff members, this was the allegation, participated in some way alongside Hamas on October 7th. Well, in addition, what this report says is that UNRWA staff members reported being interrogated about the work performed by UNRWA and the specific functions they perform on behalf of UNRWA. They also reported being subjected to threats and coercion while in detention and being pressured to make forced confessions against the agency, including that the agency has affiliations with Hamas and the UNRWA staff took part in the October 7th attacks against Israel. So what this report indicates is that those supposed confessions were obtained under torture. This, again, Saagar, is something that had been previously reported in the press, but confirmation here coming from a UN body of the outright torture being committed routinely against Palestinian detainees being held by Israel. We got some statement from the State Department of like, you know, we want answers from Israel. I'm sure we'll never get those.
Yeah, it's ironic, right? And it's also one of those, an interesting point that Dave brought up last night at the Zero Hedge debate is he kept saying, like, one of the reasons that we're able to have hostage swaps is he's like, because Israel has a bunch of hostages, prisoners. And it was one of those things where I was thinking, I was like, yeah, you know what? That really doesn't get a lot more attention about who exactly some of these prisoners are. And in terms of the way, not only that they're treated, but in terms of the way that they're like disparately viewed. And I think that that is part of the issue overall with U.S. policy. We focus a lot on one group, we completely obscure the actions of another group. And the real issue, from what I really, you know, what came home to me yesterday is that for the pro-Israel side, moral relativism itself is the enemy. And the enemy of that, and I understand that to a certain extent, but the issue is that whenever we're talking here, specifically about the government, a third-party actor allegedly for the U.S., and our disparate treatment and the way that we view one group and not the other group, I think that's where everything just completely falls apart, because we're not even talking about our interests here. We're just like blindly supporting another group.
Well, there's just a blanket assumption that if it's the actions of Israelis, if they do something wrong, which, you know, comes with a lot of, well, I don't know, who said that, and we need proof, and whatever, and maybe it's just Hamas made this up, or you're anti-Semitic, that's why you're saying this. But if they, in some rare instance, did something wrong, it was always with the best of intentions. Whereas if it was a Palestinian, and certainly if it was Hamas that did something wrong, well, the worst possible intentions are assumed. And so you can, you know, some of the comments that were made with a straight face about like, well, Israel doesn't intentionally target civilians. It's like, have you been watching the same war that we have where they literally announce a complete siege that definitionally targets literally every civilian in the Gaza Strip? Not to mention, you know, the revelations that just came out about this AI software, Where's Daddy, where they're intentionally waiting for militants to go home so that they are killed alongside their wives, children, other relatives, any other civilian who happens to be around. There's something else that is very disturbing about the way the Israelis have talked about and conducted this assault, which is they've just made the blanket assumption that any man who is even proximately fighting age is a terrorist. And that's been sort of accepted by the media. And I get it in terms of when we're looking at how many people have been killed. You know for sure if it's a woman or a child, okay, they're a civilian, so we'll count them. And then you just sort of assume then that every man who's being slaughtered deserved to be killed or deserved to be detained and tortured and had a metal rod shoved up their ass. Like there's like an actual war on men and assumption that they are inherently guilty if they happen to be of fighting age that I find to be very deeply, deeply disturbing. At the same time, we're getting another bombshell report about our own government, which again, remember the context of the segment, just certified so that we can continue to ship Israel weapons, that Israel is not violating international humanitarian law or committing war crimes. Okay, put this up on the screen. So our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is sitting on staff recommendations to sanction certain Israeli military units which were linked to killings or rapes. This is a ProPublica report. Let me read you a little bit of this. A special State Department panel recommended months ago that Tony Blinken disqualify multiple Israeli military and police units from receiving U.S. aid after reviewing allegations they committed serious human rights abuses. But Blinken has failed to act on the proposal in the face of growing international criticisms of the Israeli military's conduct in Gaza. The incidents under review mostly took place in the West Bank and occurred before October 7th. They include reports of extrajudicial killings by the Israeli border police, an incident in which a battalion gagged, handcuffed, and left an elderly Palestinian-American man for dead, and an allegation that interrogators tortured and raped a teenager who had been accused of throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails. And part of that torture was attempting to obtain a confession from this teenager who they allegedly raped with an object and tortured in a variety of other ways. So let me just underscore for you. Number one, this was before October 7th. So this idea that everything was all hunky-dory and peaceful and there was a ceasefire and whatever before October 7th, clearly nonsense. This was the West Bank. This wasn't even Gaza. So you can't do, but Hamas with any of this. And second of all, when the State Department came out and said, we have no evidence that they've committed human rights abuses, it's a lie. It's just a lie. Your own State Department panel told you they were committing human rights abuses. You have the report. It's sitting in your briefcase or in your desk or in your email file or wherever. You have it. So when you say we have no evidence of that, you are just directly bold-faced lying, which isn't a surprise, but it's still important to have this direct confirmation from ProPublica.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, the reason why it matters, I think, just to reiterate, is that if you find them officially in violation, then you can't give them any aid legally because of the Leahy law. We have laws on the books that are designed specifically for this purpose. But I will also say they have always found a way. And like I said, one of the first stories that I chased hard here in Washington is that the US government had direct evidence that the Afghan military, who we were funding, very similar cases, were raping little boys, straight up. And that our money was directly supporting the warlords who were participating in this. And in fact, one of the sources that I had told me that in some cases, U.S. military equipment, Humvees and others provided to the Afghans were actually being used to transport some of these children. And what ended up happening, all of this, by the way, is sitting in a vault. It's in Congress. They just won't let you and I see it. There's an unclassified version that was eventually, some of it was released, some of it was leaked to the Washington Post. But because if they released those findings, we would have to shut off the whole war in Afghanistan. And this was while we were still involved in that. So what do you think they did? They just classified the entire thing. And then they also started doing all kinds of other things where certain casualty numbers and others what ended up being released. That's when we could tell how badly the Afghan military was doing. So what they would do is they would just classify the number of dead for the first time in 19 years or whatever of our experience in Afghanistan. And this is textbook the ways that you get around laws like this. And it is just, this is the real deep state. Right here. This is the deep state.
You know, there have been a few State Department officials, employees who have resigned out of horror at the Biden administration's policy vis-a-vis Israel. And one of the things they point to is that Israel gets this special treatment. You know, if it was another country, certainly anyone who was remotely adversarial, okay, we've got our process, we had our panel. This panel specifically exists to look at potential human rights abuses with regards to Israel specifically. Like, that's the whole point of the panel. Any other country has that panel, they make their recommendations, actions are generally taken. You're making a good point about how there are other exceptions as well. But that Israel is treated unlike other nation. And it really turns on the head, you know, the thing that gets thrown at people who are especially trying to support Palestinian rights or who are deeply concerned about this conflict or are saying, hey, I'm going to vote based on Joe Biden's facilitation of the slaughter of Palestinians here. Is, well, why are you singling out Israel? Why are you just picking on Israel? And it really turns that on its head, because what you can see is actually the U.S. government singles out Israel time and time again for special treatment and allows our own government to flout laws put in place to constrain behavior and to make sure that we aren't shipping the bombs that get dropped on refugee camps as one example. But when it comes to Israel, all of that gets buried, it gets pushed aside. There's a special procedure that's different from when it comes to other countries. And so you see it very clearly in this instance. You know, I'm curious to see how Matt Miller or whoever's at the podium today in the State Department briefing, if they have one, how they deal with this latest very inconvenient fact. It'll be some version of like,
we're investigating.
We are investigating. I haven't seen the report. We'll look into it. We'll get back to you. We take it seriously, of course. But they're always investigating and they're never coming to any conclusions when it comes to Israel. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.